Well, welcome viewers. This talk is on something that may be a little bit uncomfortable for you, but let me define clearly first. I'm going to be talking about the spirit of lust, and most people mean a pattern of compulsive sexual desire that overrides judgment, distorts relationships, and becomes identity level behavior. Now, whether someone frames it spiritually or psychologically, the impact lands in the same human places. And here's how I've structured it. The personal impacts of the spirit of lust. Number one, psychological effects. A, distorted desire system. That's how it works. Your whole desire systems become distorted. I know people that are in their 80s that should have been sorting out how they were going to use the last parts of the sand in the hourglass of their life in a comfortable way, and they're still chasing, even though they're unable to possibly even have a proper relationship, people that they can spend time with to experience lust. It's a distorted desire system that overrides responsibilities and accountabilities, priorities and things that are important. People will abandon everything to fulfill the desires of what Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 22 describe as deceitful lust, because that's what lust is. It's completely and utterly deceitful. So this is about these next points. A distorted desire system is number one. Sexual desire becomes detached from intimacy. The sex is more important than the relationship. And if the sex becomes bad, then apparently the relationship's bad. It's distorted, and people suffer because genuine people want to nurture and contribute to a relationship, and now we have someone that's measuring the relationship by sexual performance, and sexual performance can be like the wind. Good and bad, like a racehorse, I suppose. Win one week and lose the next. Particularly when you get older, it becomes an irregularity. It takes effort, and the body doesn't do things that it used to, and things like this. The whole thing becomes detached from intimacy, and then a disordered desire system. B is novelty seeking. The novelty seeking increases while satisfaction decreases. There's no end to the next buzz and the measure of that buzz. If you have a declined buzz or a low buzz, then lust forces you to look for an increased level of fulfillment. And so novelty seeking increases and satisfaction decreases, because it's built on the premise that sexual desire has become detached from intimacy. And then C, escalation. It escalates into more extreme stimuli. So, say for instance, you're having normal, healthy sexual experiences, and then they become bored, particularly if you mix drugs and alcohol and things like this with it all. The behaviours will increase. There'll be more, let's say, adventurous, which can lead to reckless sexual adventures. But adventures as well can only go so far, and then they become either just outright negligent, or dangerous, and that puts people into a different position where they don't want to be in those environments. So escalation moves towards more extreme stimuli. And then you have the cognitive preoccupation. It moves us to the cognitive preoccupation of the spirit of lust with intrusive sexual thoughts. Sexual thoughts begin to overtake your mind. You'll be sitting there and you'll be thinking, where on earth did that thought come from? And the confronting and shocking surprise is it's all part of a matrix that's working out of the lust that's within, the way we're made. But it's become perverted, it's become a master instead of a servant. And that's not a good place to find yourself in. Because cognitive preoccupation, B, reduces concentration and productivity, because you're presupposed to thinking about where your next fulfillment is going to come from, sexual fulfillment. Excuse me, viewers. And so you can see that it spirals out of control. And it spirals out of control micro-incrementally over long periods of time, but catastrophically in the end. And then once reduced concentration and productivity falls into play, which is a big sign to the people around the person that's experiencing this, you'll see ritualized fantasy cycles where these people engage each other, but only for the purposes of sex. And if that means sex, drugs and rock and roll, well, so be it. And then you go into category C, identity fragmentation, and this is the object. This is how the devil, if you like, this is how the things that want to pull you down in life work, through the forces of the spirit of lust. Because identity fragmentation, A, is public the self versus secret self. It's a divide. Like, I've known women that you'd meet in public and never imagine in a million years the sexual activities that they partake in. You would never imagine, you would never think in a million years. And so then identity fragmentation results in growing shame and compartmentalization. Growing shame and compartmentalization. Everything becomes compartmentalized, because when lust becomes the master, everything has to umbrella off that support. Lust must come first. I know people that have lost their businesses over lust. The Roman Empire, in many ways, was contributed to its downfall because of lust. This isn't just some little, leaf on a tree problem. This is a problem that has hounded humankind since its conception. It's a very serious human problem. And so growing shame, which contributes to the degeneration of self-confidence and motivation, compartmentalizes. I could even say it compartmentalizes this lust as the only priority. And as I said before, particularly if you mix it with drugs and alcohol, somebody's going to get hurt. And of course, C, self-concept shifts from person to appetite, and the appetite is never fulfilled. It is never fulfilled. And so the self-concept, how well I should be looking after myself, going to work, things that I should avoid, are all neglected to fulfill the appetite of lust. And then point D, and this is a real serious, important point, diminished self-control. Diminished self-control, because it becomes, as it were, an internal frenzy. And it's a pattern, a feeding pattern, that is never really satisfied. Because diminished self-control, point A, is an impulse override of long-term goals. All long-term goals have to be perceived through the fulfillment of lust. I've known men that have bought houses and wondered why they did it later, investments, because the real estate agent was hot and she just had an influence over him. And don't think these women don't realise that. Another bloke opened a bank account in a bank he promised he'd never ever bank with, because the lady that worked behind the teller was attractive to him. And then he had a bank account that he didn't really use, and a person that he never really got to know. This is how lust deceives. And its impulse overrides long-term goals, long-term visions. It changes everything. And it justifies narratives. It's harmless. Everyone does it. It's got a justification narrative. It doesn't hurt. That's what you do. This is how it is. And if you're in an unsupported, healthy, monogamous relationship, lust can slowly, but ultimately, in a very quick and savage way, pull your whole life to pieces from the inside out. Because the habit reinforcement loops. It keeps going round in a cycle. You can't satisfy it, and the more you allow it to grow, it becomes like a snowball. It'll melt, but then it'll reform again. It just doesn't go away. And when lust starts to overtake the mind, particularly when it shouldn't, and that's when it does, all sorts of bad things can happen, unpredictable things that are unnatural, things that you would never perceive a particular person to have happen. You know, some people just should have but never got anywhere in life the way that they could have. Well, if you look behind closed doors, the problem just very well could be lust. Now, with the habit reinforcement looping, there's going to be emotional consequences. And this is our second major point. Emotional consequences. The shame spiral. We mentioned shame earlier, but now we're going into the shame spiral, which gives us point A, temporary pleasure followed by guilt. Now this happens to people that masturbate. They're addicted to masturbation. And if somebody comes along in between, that's all well and good, but don't interfere with me interfering with myself. It produces terrible guilt and horrible shame. But what happens is, once the shame and guilt's punished the mind of the person after the satisfaction or the event or whatever happens, then that shrinks back, that fades off, and the lust rises again, only to put the person back in to activities that cause guilt and shame again, and it goes around and round. It's a shame spiral. And point B, shame spiral, it will bring you to self-disgust and secrecy. What will happen is you'll promise yourself, I'll never do that again, or I'll never let that person do this to me again, or I'll never see that person again, only to find lust driving you in the opposite direction to what you promised yourself you would go. And that proves to us that sin is real, and that one of the major factors of sin is lust. Because if you're doing what you don't want to do, that you promised yourself you wouldn't do, and you find yourself doing it, then you have to admit there is such a thing called sin. It's separate to your mind, but it works from within to cause you to do things that you wish you wouldn't do. And of course the shame spiral leads to fear of exposure, because for a lot of these people, we don't want to be exposed doing things that we would find to be possibly perverted or a little bit too far south of where healthy sexual activity should be. But again, it depends on the level of drugs and alcohol and other recreational things that people do to enhance the frenzy and the satisfaction. And so along with shame spiraling, point B, you get emotional numbing. And what happens with emotional numbing is you have decreased empathy. So you become uninterested in what the other person experiences, as long as you get the experience you expect, even if it's at the expense of the person that you're sharing it with, or even if it's the expense of yourself. Oh, I'll never masturbate again, and the next minute you're in a frenzy. You have decreased empathy because the lust is more important than the consequences. It's more important than the guilt and the shame. And then you have reduced capacity for deep connection, because you haven't built your intimacy on connection. You've built it on satisfaction, and satisfaction's just a part of the matrix. It's not a person, it's a feeling. And so you have reduced capacity for deep connection because you haven't built those faculties in yourself. You haven't exercised them, you haven't nurtured them, and they're just not there. So your capacity for deep connection decreases, it becomes numb. And they say this about women that have had many partners. Their pair bonding awareness, their pair bonding capabilities just go numb. They're just not there anymore. It just becomes objective, not intimate. And then you have a pleasure threshold, and that increases. It's like the joy in normal life decreases. So your pursuit, and we said this earlier, comes back to fulfilling the level of pleasure that you think you require and that you desire, and it's more easily said than done in a lot of cases. And again, particularly if there's drugs and alcohol, social recreational drugs involved, because they throw out the whole way in which the body accommodates and the mind accommodates sexual desire. It gets overtaken by lust, driven by the chemicals that are changing the life cycle within that person. And then you've got anxiety and paranoia, fear of being discovered, hypervigilant about digital trails, who you've connected with, who you've mixed with, And then you got relationship insecurity, because when you're in the realm of lust, you don't know who to trust, where they're going to go next, who they're going to engage next, are they going to be loyal? This is one of the consequences of that lifestyle. You have to pay the price that relationship security is at a minimum. There's no guarantees in the world of lust, because people that are in lust are opportunists. If they see an opportunity, regardless of what responsibilities they have and commitments they have in a monogamous relationship, if in that moment things go south and there's an opportunity to fulfill their lust at that given moment, they'll risk it all. And that's why a lot of people end up with nothing, because they actually do cross lines that are not accepted or part of a healthy way in which to conduct yourself in a relationship, and they lose the relationship. Which brings us to point number 3, relational damage. This is I think it's the last big one, point number 3, relational damage. And point A of point number 3 is objectification. Viewing people as their bodies rather than persons. Viewing people as their bodies rather than persons. You see, because all you're trying to do is fulfill your lust. You're not building a relationship, and you'll cycle around. This is where a lot of women and men lose decades of their lives catering to the person's cycle of lust. And it comes with all sorts of havoc and sadness and trauma and torment. A lot of people write these people off as labeling them as narcissists and this, that and the other. But they got caught in the person's cycle of lust. And it can go on for years. Some people catch on to it really quick and go, no, I'm not going to do that. Experience teaches you. But unfortunately for some people, it all becomes all too late. They've become too old. They can't recover. One thing you can't recover, unfortunately, is time. And so what objectification will do is cause transactional interactions. And this is, again, one of these opportunistic parts of life where lust will accommodate itself regardless of the consequences, who it harms, who it affects, women, children, families, all the rest of it, to fulfill itself. Transactional interactions. I'll give you this if you give me that, don't tell them. It's very punishing. And some women stay in relationships with these men who sleep with other women and all the rest of it. And it's not what they wanted, and they waste years, and they never really recover, because they become emotionally numb, remember? And then reduced respect in romantic partnerships. You give up hope. You just think it's about lust, particularly if you've been on the end of it. And you go, well, I'll just have to settle for this person's level of lust. But what lust will do too, it'll turn around and sabotage the person's capability to be aroused. And so what you end up with is a dysfunctional person filled up with drugs and all this other stuff to help them to perform. But it's all superficial. It's all fulfilling the spirit of lust. It's not accomplishing anything else, and everybody ends up worn out, tired, nothing gets resolved, and it all ends up in a big breakup. And then you have trust erosion, hidden behavior, which undermines intimacy. And this is what we're talking about. You see, everything becomes deceitful. Everything has to be checked. What are they doing now? Where are they now? What are they up to now? Now what's going to happen? Hidden behavior undermines intimacy. And what happens then is the person that they're trying to have a relationship with undermines the intimacy because it's not valued. It's just an opportunistic event to fulfill lust. It's not about getting close, it's not about caring, it's not about sharing and letting that person realise that you're there for them regardless. It's just an opportunistic moment called hidden behaviour, which undermines intimacy. It's not transparent. And then betrayal trauma in partners. I don't know how many of you are listening that may have been betrayed. It's one of the most horrible personal experiences that somebody could go through. Some people never come out the other side of it. Some people end up in mental homes for life after a marriage that's been betrayed, marriage vows betrayed, and this kind of thing. I won't go into examples because it's very real and it's very harmful, and it happens every day. And people end up with betrayal trauma, and it's from their partners. It was all because lust is opportunistic, isn't it? And people get betrayed. And then of course you have the breakdown of transparency. Things become hidden, things become taboo. We can't talk about that. Oh no, I'm not going there, I'm not, and so nothing gets resolved. And not only do you have a breakdown of transparency, as mentioned before, you actually have a breakdown of intimacy where the intimacy is supposed to be directed. And then, point C, we have attachment distortion. And attachment distortion causes, point A, avoidant patterns become reinforced. Everyone starts to avoid because people get sick of lust. Once it's become clear that somebody's just an object of this lust, that it's become more important than other priorities and other necessities, avoidant patterns start to become reinforced. Because these are people, ultimately, once you realise what's going on, that we all need to avoid. Because lust is not something you want to cultivate. Lust is something that you don't want to have grow in your mind. It's something that you want to avoid. It's not something that you want to become a victim of. Because the lust is the servant of none and the master of all. That's what it is. And then intimacy becomes tied to performance, and you can't, without enhancement, particularly when you get older, perform in at levels that are going to be outstanding all the time. There has to be a civil, healthy level of intimacy, because lust takes things to the limit. Lust, the jockey has to jockey right in the thoroughbred flat out the whole race, and then the thoroughbred eventually has to be shot because it's been overdone. That's what lust does. It overdoes something that should have just been a trot or maybe just a walk. No, lust has to go full, flat out until nothing's left. That's how lust works. And then attachment distortion can be related to emotional vulnerability decreases. In other words, you become personally negligent. You're not worried about what happens to you. You're not worried about what the consequences of your decisions are. You're just worried about fulfilling your lust. Which brings us to point number 4, spiritual impact around a religious framing. Let's just reframe this religiously, in a sense, or spiritually, spiritual impact. Part A, separation from a moral centre, which is perceived distance from God or conscience. See, what happens is God and conscience will be left standing when it comes to lust. Okay? Lust is like blood in the water for a shark. That's what it is. When the shark senses blood, there's no stopping it. And when lust senses an opportunity, there's no stopping it. It doesn't matter about God or conscience or what's important, what the consequences are. Lust will separate itself from a moral centre. And separation from a moral centre in terms of a spiritual life is when your prayer life declines. Prayer to God, yeah, all that, but some people just sit and think to themselves. Well, that becomes distant. It declines, and then spiritual practices begin to feel hollow. You begin to feel hollow. You lose touch with yourself. You don't. The clarity and the peacefulness that you had where you'd sit and think to yourself is in the shadows. It's lost in the fog. Because lust is too busy blowing around and trying to direct you in any which way whatsoever, that all that stuff gets lost. And of course you'll end up with a hardened conscience. Initial conviction weakens over time. You just become hard. You allow yourself to be battered in the playground of lust. And rationalisation becomes easier. You can rationalise things that you in your normal, without lust life, would say no to. You now convince yourself these things are okay, and it's easy to do. You become used to it. You're like a drug addict. I'll never do it again. And the next thing, you're doing it again. Guilt and shame come after that. And then sensitivity to moral boundaries dulls. Everything's falling to pieces. Because these things are the things that help us to stay on path. And cycles of repentance and relapse, confession without behaviour change, despair or spiritual exhaustion, identity defined by struggle. And then point 5, neurological reinforcement, dopamine dysregulation, the reward system, the hyperstimulations run by lust. You'll have a reduced response to normal pleasures, and so you start to seek deviancy. The deregulation, escalation and tolerance patterns, values disintegrate. There's no boundaries anymore. You leave yourself open to all sorts of different degenerative conduct to fulfill your lust. And the habit loop forms. You have the cue, the craving, the behaviour, temporary relief, regret, and then repeat. Cue, craving, behaviour, temporary relief, regret, and repeat. And the brain becomes wired towards immediate gratification over rational bonding. That's why pair bonding becomes non-existent in the values of that person. We just have to fulfill our lust. And so the long-term consequences are an addiction risk. Well, I think it's an addiction certainty myself, because you end up with compulsive, in some cases, compulsive pornography use. You'll become reckless and go into sexual risk-taking. And that can be very consequential relative to disease and other mental brokenness that comes with that. You'll have financial and legal consequences. People fall out in the middle of all this, and the next minute, because they can't separate, there's ABOs and they're still having sex, and someone ends up in jail and all that. Trauma bonds and things, and emotional isolation, fear of authentic exposure, deep loneliness despite sexual activity. And many of us have experienced that. You're with somebody, you're having the sexual experiences, but you're sitting there on your own. And then inability to sustain meaningful intimacy. And this is what happens. You've sabotaged yourself. You've fulfilled your lust, you've chased after it, but you haven't nurtured and maintained the qualities that you need to sustain a proper, healthy, functioning relationship, which leads to moral exhaustion, chronic inner conflict, loss of integrity, alignment, and cynicism towards self and others. So how do you break the pattern? How do you break this pattern? Radical honesty with self. You've just got to be radically honest and go, I'm suffering from lust and I need help. Environmental restructuring. Reduce triggers. Don't put yourself in places, watch things or see things or do things that are going to trigger lust. And have people around you that are going to help you to be accountable. You can get therapy for underlying trauma from these activities. And reframing sexuality towards connection, not consumption, can be a way to crawl yourself back to where you left. And spiritual disciplines grounded in grace, not fear. So here's the blunt truth, viewers, as I close. Lust itself is a normal human impulse. The spirit language usually describes when desire stops serving life and starts ruling it. Desire, viewers, is an evil. But when it comes to the master instead of the servant, it reshapes us from the inside out, and not in a way that's flattering. So you think about where you're up to, what you need to do to disintegrate this overwhelming lust, so that you don't put yourself in positions where you're just used by somebody for